"They were closed," I shouted, as 3 loud knocks resounded on the door of my office. The door burst open a second later nonetheless, and a woman in her late 20s with an icy gaze walked in. She closed the door behind her and strode up to my desk like a peacock, without uttering a word. I noticed that she wore a small cross around her neck. "Didn't you hear what I said?" I asked. I puffed my cigarette, allowing the smoke to steadily leave my mouth and twirl in the air, before blending in with the rest of the room's stuffy atmosphere. I put the cigarette on the ashtray filled with other butts and ashes. "I need your help, officer." She spoke in a soft yet stern tone, ignoring my previous remark. "Detective," I corrected her. "And if you want to talk, schedule an appointment first and then we can discuss things." I opened the drawer and pulled out my flask, taking a gulp from it. The booze burnt my throat but reinvigorated me. I knew that I was slowly driving myself to my own grave with so much drinking and smoking, but I was way past caring. I returned the flask to the drawer and put the cigarette back in my mouth. The woman looked at me with a grimace of disgust. "My daughter's missing," she said, now with more concern in her voice. That sentence struck a nerve with me, but I tried not to show it. She sat on the chair in front of my desk and stared at me with an unrelenting gaze, so intently that I had no other choice but to give her my undivided attention. I puffed my cigarette once more, put it out in the ashtray, and I lit another one. "Sorry, I don't do missing persons of that sort. I can help you find a lost relative or find out if your husband's having an affair, but not something like this. Besides, you're better off going to the police for that," I said, leaning back in my chair and staring at her. "I already did, they can't help me," she said coldly and reached inside her jacket. A moment later, she took out a photograph which she proceeded to place on the desk in front of me. "This is my daughter, Alexandra. She's 12. We live in a town called Northberry." "Never heard of it," I said, picking up the picture. On it was a little girl in a school uniform with short black hair, smiling at the camera. I grabbed the picture and curiously inspected it, flipping it over to see if anything was written on the back, but there was nothing there. The lady responded, "I didn't expect you to. It's a really small town with a population of 1,500. "What did you say your name was, miss?" I asked, sliding the picture back to her. Lydia Burrows." "And how long has your little girl been missing?" I asked, a thought forming at the back of my mind that tempted me to consider taking this case. "A week, and it's not just my little girl. Children have been going missing in Northberry for months, vanishing without a trace." I raised my chin and tapped my fingers on the table in bafflement. "I haven't heard of this on the news anywhere," I responded suspiciously. "The media doesn't cover anything there. For all they're concerned, the children wandered off into the old mine and died by accident. But there's something else at play here. Something or something is responsible for kidnapping the children. I'm sure of it." "When did you say that the first disappearance had occurred?" "Well, about 6 months ago. Every month, one child disappears. People know it, but they don't want to talk about it. They live their lives in hope that their kid won't be next." "So why stay in that town if you knew the danger?" Lydia looked down at her lap before back at me and saying, "Oh, I was born and raised there. It's a very small but family-like Christian community. Being educated in the St. Peter Elementary School, I had an enlightening experience and I wanted my daughter to experience the same thing. There is no other place in America that offers the education that Northberry has. Trust me, I looked it up." "So you took away from your daughter a chance for a proper education and put her in a religious school, in the middle of nowhere?" I judgmentally asked, not caring about using the Lord's name in vain in front of a religious person. Over the years of my career as a cop, I've dealt with all sorts of parents, and I knew exactly the type that Lydia was. The religious helicopter kind, which brought more trouble than help with her overzealousness and messed up their own kids beyond repair. Something about all of that made me want to take this case even more. Lydia frowned before saying, "With all due respect, Detective, but how I raised my daughter is none of your concern." "You're right, please continue." I decided not to argue and I put out my cigarette. My daughter always arrives home by 4 p.m. after school, but last Thursday she was supposed to have extracurricular activities and come back home around 7. When 8 o'clock came, I decided to call her, but she wasn't answering her phone. She's been gone ever since. Did she mention what kind of activities that she would be attending and where? No, and I didn't ask. My daughter's a good student. I don't need to hover over her and check her every step along the way. She was independent, so I gave her the freedom of responsibility. She spoke so calmly that I was amazed at the frigidity this woman displayed talking about her daughter's disappearance. I took a mental note to probe her for some more questions later and determined if she had anything to do with Alexandra's disappearance. She continued, "The police found no lead on any suspects for any of the missing children, so that's why I contacted you. I know you probably don't deal with this sort of case usually, but I'm willing to pay you handsomely. How does $10,000 up front sound? And another $10,000 once the case is solved." "Now hold on, I haven't even said that I would take the case yet," I interjected, shocked by the price that she had offered. "I need an answer as soon as possible, because if you will not help me, then I'll have to look for someone else. There are 6 children that could be either dead or in danger," she coldly responded. I scratched my chin, observing her with a contemptuous glance. The woman must have been really desperate to come seeking help from a washed-out ex-cop. The money sounded nice, but it wasn't so much about the cash. It's been a week and the little girl was probably already dead, just like all the others. But I knew what it was like living in anticipation, worried day and night, jumping at every call and message. And getting closure was better no matter what the outcome was. "All right, fine," I finally responded, as I lit another cigarette. Reaching Northberry was harder than expected. There were no ways to mark it on the GPS, and the people either never heard about the place or knew vaguely how to reach it. Even with Lydia's instructions, it was a pain driving there. The miles of area surrounding the town were comprised of forested hills and old, perilous roads that curved on in an inconsistent manner until they reached a clearing leading downhill into the town. Northberry was exactly how I imagined it. A dozen blocks put together to harbor the town with barely anything of necessity located inside. Passing through made me feel like driving through a ghost town, and there were no people anywhere outside. Don't get me wrong, it looked like a nice place for a weekend getaway, but not a place that you would want to live in. I stopped the car and I opened up the folder of printed documents that Lydia sent me on email. There were a few pictures of Alexandra, her medical and school record, names of other 5 children who had gone missing, and potential places that I should visit for witness questioning. It was 2 p.m. when I arrived, so I first decided to visit the St. Peter Elementary School. "Barry Torres, private investigator. I'm here to see Teacher Reynolds." I introduced myself to the caretaker at the entrance. The old man raised his bald head and smiled a half-toothed grin as he said, "Detective, we've been expecting you. My name is Gerald. Please come this way." He kindly led me through the corridor. "The children are in class right now, but it'll be over in 10 minutes. "I see. Are you the only one working at the entrance, Gerald?" I asked as we made our way to the 2nd floor. "I am. However, I have other duties to attend to, so I am never at the entrance at specific times. This is a big school and there's a lot of work to be done." "Do you keep a timeline of your duties?" Oh, I do actually. We have a diary at the entrance, so if you want, I can show it to you later. Thank you. Is there another exit out of the school? There's a door all the way at the back. It leads into the schoolyard. We stopped in front of one of the classrooms. Well, here we are. Please wait until the bell rings, Gerald said. I nodded and he left the corridor with the sound of heavy footsteps echoing. I looked through the glass on the door and saw a relatively young teacher writing something on the blackboard and speaking to the students. I reached into the pocket of the inside of my jacket and I pulled out my flask. I took one sip and patiently waited until the bell rang. Only moments after it did, doors started to swing open and the murmurs of little kids filled the corridor as they exited the classrooms and went for their 5-minute breaks. Reynolds was in the classroom arranging some folders, so I took the chance to go inside and intercept them. Mr. Reynolds, I asked. He raised his head in my direction and nodded, suspiciously asking, Yes, what can I do for you? I'm Detective Barry Torres, and I'm here to ask you a few questions about the missing children in Northberry. Mr. Torres, it's a pleasure to meet you. Reynolds shook my hand and his demeanor seemed to suddenly change from cautious to friendly, as a smile was strewn across his face. He sat down and leaned in his chair, crossing his legs. So, how can I help you, Detective? He asked curiously. Last Thursday, Alexandra Burrows had her last lesson for the day with you. Have you seen where she went after that? I knew that Lydia had expected me to prioritize finding her child, but all 6 children were equal in my mind. I would, however, need to follow the freshest trail, though. I'm afraid I don't know. I saw her exiting the classroom with her classmate, Emily Strauss, but that's all that I saw. According to the police report, Emily told the police that Alexandra stayed in school. However, she doesn't know where. The report said that Alexandra had extracurricular activities to attend to after school, but the school has no records of her having any such activities. Well, that is correct. I find it odd. Reynolds scratched his chin. I know that the school is very, very strict about the rules and they try to keep close tabs on all the students, especially with so many children that are going missing in the last 6 months or so. I jotted down some notes before looking back up at him. What was Alexandra like? I asked. Reynolds shrugged. Well, she was very attentive in class, one of the better students. Nothing more that I can say about her. Had you noticed anything weird prior to her disappearance? Reynolds said, before snapping his fingers and continuing. She did have one incident about a month ago. During PE class with Mrs. Ambers, she was apparently bullied by the other girls in the locker room. I don't know the details, so you should ask the teacher. I see. I wrote down the name of the teacher. Who was in the school during the time of her disappearance? Reynolds thought for a moment. It's hard to tell. There should be a list that you can see in the principal's office, but my guess is there wasn't more than 3 teachers at that time, plus the janitor. I scratched my cheek. So, Alexandra was either coaxed into joining after-class activities off the grid, which were never even on the list, or she deliberately broke the rules and ran away, possibly due to the bullying, depending on how extensive it was. At this moment, I didn't have enough information to reach any kind of conclusion. Do you happen to remember seeing in which direction Alexandra went after exiting your classroom? I asked, trying to narrow down the investigation. Reynolds shook his head mournfully. He said, Sorry, I was still in the classroom when everybody left. I know that Alexandra and Emily were the last ones to leave, but I didn't see them after they went out. And what about the other missing children? Have you noticed anything strange with them prior to their disappearances, like bullying, behavioral changes and such? Nothing like that. Some of the kids that went missing were top of the class. living their lives normally every day, and then they vanished without a trace. I see, I said, and I reached inside my jacket. When I pulled out my flask, Reynolds frowned and said, Detective, please put that away. This is a place of God. Fine, I'm almost done here anyway. I don't mean just the school, Detective. This entire town is a religious sanctuary. You will find that the townsfolk are less than welcoming to the likes of the outsiders, especially someone who engages in such blasphemous activities. He made a disgusted grimace at the last statement. I learned to ignore such remarks over the years. I have everything that I need here. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds, I said, and I left the classroom. I contemplated who the potential witnesses could be, and the first person who came to my mind was the janitor. Oh, and one more thing, Detective, Reynolds shouted as I stepped over the threshold. I turned around to face him. Who sent you here on an investigation? He asked. Lydia Burrows. I'm sorry, who? He narrowed his eyes. The mother of Alexandra, Lydia Burrows. Reynolds shook his head steadily as he said, That can't be right. Alexandra doesn't have a mother. What do you mean she has no mother? I asked, suspiciously frowning. I mean her mother died when Alexandra was 3 years old. It's been only her father Harry taking care of her. Is the father still in town? Of course, write down this address. Reynolds proceeded to tell me the address of the Burrows family household, and I jotted it down on my notepad. So, is there anybody going by the name of Lydia Burrows in this town? I asked. Not that I know of. This is a small town and everybody knows everybody, so I can't imagine not knowing anybody from the Burrows family. I see. I stared at the notes that I took so far. Is the principal still here? Yeah, his office is on this floor. Turn right after you exit and then right once more. You should see a door that says Principal's Office on the right. I nodded and I left the classroom. My mind was racing faster than I had anticipated it would after the conversation with the teacher, and I was furious at Lydia or whoever she was. If my client wasn't Alexandra's mother, then who was she? Moreover, was Lydia her real name, or did she choose a pseudonym? And why did she want me to start this case in the first place? There must have been something of importance to her on this investigation. Maybe she was a mother of one of the other kids, but then it still didn't make sense for her to lie. Whoever she was, she must have anticipated that I would figure out pretty quickly that she was an imposter. I made a mental note to call her later. By the time that I was out of the classroom, the murmurs of the kids had died down entirely and everybody was in class, making my footsteps echo in the hallway. I knocked on the door of the principal's office and heard a female voice say, "Come in." I opened the door, and to my right was a secretary's desk, with a middle-aged woman sitting by it, staring at me with curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked politely with a smile. "Detective Torres, a private investigator. I'm here to talk to the principal." Her smile dropped as I saw her get visibly nervous. Some people were not comfortable around law enforcement, and despite only being a private detective, my demeanor still caused some people to feel uneasy. I attributed her anxiety to that, but reminded myself to question her if I reached a dead end with every other lead. "Give me a moment, please," she said, giving me a forced smile this time. She pressed a button on the desk phone and said, "Mr. Greenwood, there's a private investigator here to see you." A moment of pause ensued before a deep voice came through the speaker. "Thank you, Darcy. Let him in." "You can go see the principal now," the secretary smiled, as if I hadn't just heard what he said over the phone. I nodded and proceeded through the door. The office was ostentatious from first glance, contrasting the sterility of the pristine school. There was a big shelf packed with books on the right side of the room, various trophies on the other end and diplomas, certificates, and thank you notes on the walls. In front of me, behind the desk, sat a burly, bald black man with fingers crossed. Upon my entrance, he stood up and approached to shake hands. "Mr. Torres," he said, "Caretaker Gerald told me that you were here. Please, take a seat." He gestured to the wooden chair in front of the desk. I slumped down as he sat down in his own, more comfortable leather seat, going back to the previous position of crossing his fingers. "Would you like a drink, Detective? I have some whiskey here if you would like," he asked. The focus this man had on the materialistic items made me question his dedication to the learnings that his school was offering. "I thought this was a place of God," I sarcastically remarked. Greenwood gave me a smile that looked like he was annoyed before saying, "So what can I do for you, Detective? I assume you're here because of the missing children." "Correct. I know you're busy, so I'll get right to it. I need you to tell me about Alexandra Burrows." "What would you like to know?" He cleared his throat and leaned back in his chair. "Can you tell me who was in school at the time of her disappearance?" "Well, yes, that would be math teacher Reynolds, Bible study teacher Mr. Schaefer and Mrs. Wilkins, the discipline teacher. And then there was, of course, caretaker Gerald, cleaning lady Bryant, and myself." "Is there a way for you to confirm if everybody else left the school by that time?" "No, not me, but Mrs. Bryant can, because she's responsible for cleaning all the classrooms. So if anybody else remained in the school premises, she would have known." "And where were you between the times of 4 p.m. and 7 p.m.? "Right here in my office. I often have a lot of paperwork to do, so I stay overtime. But around 5 p.m. I headed home." I jotted everything down while Greenwood swiveled in his chair with a squeaking noise, staring at me in anticipation. He glanced intermittently from my eyes to my notes. I continued, "All right. So, what after-class activities was Alexandra usually taking?" "Well, she participated in lots of activities. I can't count them all, Detective. You need to understand that she was one of the better students in our school. She went above and beyond in everything that she did." I was told that she had no extracurricular activities assigned on the day of her disappearance. Well, that is correct. And we don't know who told her to attend the activity, nor what activity it was. "And what can you tell me about the other missing children?" "Not much. They disappeared so abruptly that nobody could have foreseen it happening." "Where were they when they disappeared?" "The disappearances were very random. Alexandra went missing in school, but the others either never made it home from school, or they went missing while they were out somewhere." "I see. A lot of people speculate that they went missing in the mines. What can you tell me about that?" "Oh, that." He chuckled as he shook his head. "I wouldn't concern myself too much with rumors, Detective. The old mines have been closed off for years, ever since the accident." "What accident?" I asked. Greenwood continued. "There was a huge cave-in back in the 70s, and since then the mines have been cordoned off. There's no way for those kids to get anywhere near there." He put his hands on his lap now as he continued swiveling left and right, slowly. I tapped the pen on my notepad repeatedly, pursing my lips. I started to feel exhausted and I needed a drink or a smoke. I stared at the names of the potential suspects that I had wrote down. Reynolds, Schaefer, Wilkins, Gerald, Bryant. I talked to Reynolds, but I still had a lot of work to do. I decided to narrow it down and go by what the principal said, by asking the cleaning lady who she saw in school last Thursday. That could help me speed things up. "Is Mrs. Bryant in school right now?" I asked, underlining her name on my notepad. "Yes, go talk to Gerald. He'll know exactly where she is," Greenwood said. "I have one final question." I looked up at him to see him staring at me in anticipation, still swiveling steadily. "Go ahead," he smiled. "Who is Lydia Burrows?" Greenwood stopped swiveling in his chair and suddenly, without the squeaking, Silence fell in the room. He frowned and scratched his chin as if trying to remember something. Doesn't ring a bell. He slowly shook his head as we maintained eye contact. I leaned forward and asked, "Are you sure about that, Mr. Greenwood?" He inhaled through his nose loudly and looked away for a moment, before he shrugged and said, "Could be a relative of Alexandra Burrows, but I don't know anyone by that name. And let me assure you, I know everybody in this town." I silently nodded, staring down at my notes again. "I should get going now. Thank you for your help, Mr. Greenwood." I stood up and he did the same. He saw me to the door and on my way out, he said, "What happened to those children is a tragedy and our town hasn't been the same since it started. Thank you for putting effort into this matter. But try not to dig too deep. You remember what Nietzsche said about the abyss. Some things are best left alone, detective." I wasn't sure if this was a heartfelt warning or a threat. Before I could give him a proper response, he politely closed the door in my face. I said goodbye to the secretary and went down to Gerald. He was sitting behind the counter at the entrance, reading a book when I arrived. Upon hearing footsteps, he raised his head, and upon realizing who was coming, he placed the bookmark between the pages that he was reading and he stood up to greet me. "Detective, how's your investigation going?" he asked. "Not sure yet. I have more questions than answers. I need you to tell me where the cleaner is." "Mrs. Bryan's?" he asked. "I saw her in classroom 105 around 10 minutes ago. She cleans in a linear but quick way, so expect to find her in around 108, 109 maybe." "Thank you. I actually have a few questions for you as well before I leave." "Oh, go on ahead. I'll do everything in my power to assist you." He sat on the table and curiously observed me. I put my hands in the pockets of my coat and said, "You were here on the day that Alexandra Burrows disappeared, correct?" "That I was." "Have you seen where she went after her lessons?" "No, sorry, like I said. I have to hop from place to place and I spent most of the day fixing the fence last Thursday." "Have you noticed anyone or anything suspicious that day on the school grounds?" He thought for a moment, staring at the ceiling. He crossed his arms, revealing a small tattoo on his forearm. When he noticed me staring, he pulled down his sleeves quickly. A moment later, he shook his head with a disappointed expression on his face, shrugged and said, "Sorry, detective. Nothing suspicious happened that day. I did my work, went home, and that was it." I scratched my chin, staring him down. Something was strange about the way that he responded and stared at me nervously, as if waiting to see if I believed him. "When I arrived earlier, you said that you had been expecting me. Who informed you of my arrival?" "One of the parents called today and said that they hired a private eye and that he would be here shortly. They blurted everything out so quickly that I never managed to catch their name though." I could not believe that Lydia would sabotage the investigation like this. Calling in advance and letting witnesses know that you're coming to question them is the worst thing that you can do. It gives them ample time to prepare their responses and even get their stories straight among each other. I was beyond mad at the client despite the enormous pay. "I see. Does the name Lydia Burrows ring a bell to you?" I asked, intent on pressing him more. "Sorry, sir." He apologized again with a grievous expression on his face. "I know this town well and ain't nobody from the Burrows family under the name Lydia that I know of." My phone started to ring and I excused myself. The caller ID said that it was Lydia, so I hastily picked it up, putting some distance between myself and the caretaker. "Hello?" I asked.
"Detective Torres."
A familiar, feminine voice resounded on the other end.
"Did you make it safely to Northberry?"
"I did, and I don't appreciate you calling to let the witnesses know that I'm coming."
"What do you mean?"
"You called the caretaker hours ago to tell them that I was on my way, and that's what he said." There was a pause before she said in a panicked, yet somehow at the same time calm tone.
Detective, listen. I never made that call, which means they're already onto you. You have to be careful who you trust. Your life could be in danger.
What are you talking about? I asked skeptically.
I'm going to send you my address and an image. If you see anyone with the same symbol as on the image, stay away from them and don't trust anything they say. Do you understand?
I was furious at her for dictating terms like this and expecting me to trust her after lying to me so blatantly. I said, "Yeah, speaking of that, I'm already finding out interesting things on my investigation." I smirked.
Oh,
She asked. "Yeah, for instance, no one here seems to know anybody called Lydia Burrows. They also claim that Alexandra's mother is dead. So why did you lie to me?" There was another pause on the line, but I knew she heard me. A moment later, she responded,
I promise to tell you everything in person, but not over the phone. Please stop by my place as soon as you're done at the school.
"Fine, I'll be there later," I said.
Thank you, officer.
"Detective," I corrected her, but she had already hung up. I went back to Gerald, who was reading his book again until I returned to him. Now, about the cleaning lady. I started when my phone had vibrated. I picked it up and opened the message sent by Lydia. There was an address and under that a text which said, "If you see anybody with this symbol, stay away from them." Under the text was an image of an upside-down cross inside a triangle. I probably stared at the picture for too long because Gerald said, "Something wrong, detective?" I looked up at him to see him staring at me with undivided attention. I put my phone back in my pocket. "No, nothing," I said, glancing at his sleeve-covered forearms again. The forearms which had the same tattoo as the symbol in the picture. Mrs. Bryans, the cleaning lady, was in room 110, neatly arranging the desks and chairs facing away from me. The classroom already seemed tidy enough to me when I arrived, and I was sure that it was due to the children's manners. She didn't notice when I came inside, so I called out to her. "Mrs. Bryans." She jumped and turned around, holding her hand on her chest, visibly startled. "My goodness," she chuckled at her own scare. "Sorry, I didn't mean to surprise you. I'm Detective Torres. Can I ask you a few questions?" "Why, yes, of course." She tucked one more chair under the desk neatly and approached to shake my hand with a smile. "How can I help you, sir?" she asked. "I'm here to investigate the missing student's case. I take it you were here last Thursday between the hours of 4 p.m. and 7 p.m., correct?" "Yes, sir." She nodded energetically. "Have you seen this girl anywhere during that time?" I pulled out the photo of Alexandra and showed it to Mrs. Bryans. Her face lit up with a smile which I took as a sign of her recognizing the victim. She said, "Oh yes, I have seen her. I think it was around 4:45 p.m. that I saw her going down into the basement. I was already done cleaning there, so I didn't go down anymore." "The basement?" "Well, yes, there is a faith and spirituality classroom down there, so I suppose she had an after-class activity to attend." "Are there any other classrooms down there?" I asked. "Oh no, the rest of the rooms are for staff only, like storages, a boiler room, and so on." "Who teaches faith and spirituality?" "Well, that would be Mr. Myers." "And was Mr. Myers in school during that time?" "No, sir, I saw him leave at around 2:30 p.m. "So that rules him out as a suspect." Alexandra went down to the basement for some reason. Again, either somebody lured her to have a class there, or she went on her own volition. The first one seemed more plausible, though. "Mrs. Bryans, who else did you see in school during these hours?" She looked away for a moment, thinking before saying, "Well, there was Mr. Schaefer and Mrs. Wilkins. Gerald was here too. Oh, and of course, Principal Greenwood." "And did you see any of them go into any places outside of their classrooms and offices? Places that they shouldn't have been?" "Not that I can think of." She thought for a moment again before saying, No, actually, Principal Greenwood did leave his office once. He went into the schoolyard and stayed there for a few minutes before returning to his office. Any idea why he went outside? No, sir. Gerald was out there fixing the fence, so I suppose he wanted to talk to him about something. And when was this? Sometime around 4:30 p.m. He went back to his office around 10 minutes later and left the school around 5, around the same time as Gerald. I left shortly after. You have a good memory, Mrs. Bryans. I gave her a faint smile, feeling the muscles in my face cramping up. She chuckled heartedly and said, "And when you work here for as long as I do, you memorize the people's patterns, sir. So, what irregular patterns have you noticed on that day, ma'am?" "Only the one with the principal. He never leaves his office, let alone goes to Gerald to talk to him. Mr. Greenwood isn't fond of chasing people around, so he instead invites them to his office when they need something, regardless of whether they're busy with work or not. It bothered us a lot at first, but later we got used to it. That's why I found it odd that he went out like that." "Maybe he couldn't get in contact with Gerald and decided to look for him instead," I asked. The cleaning lady shook her head. "Sir, I've been cleaning after Principal Greenwood for over 15 years now, and if he personally comes looking for you, it can only mean that it's a big emergency. There are no exceptions. And let me get this straight. After you saw Alexandra go down there, you didn't see her come out?" "No, sir, but I could have missed her because by the time that she was done, I was probably on the 3rd floor. "Is there a way that you could have maybe missed somebody else coming in and out of the school?" I asked. "It is possible, sir, but the person would have to have been very sneaky." "That's all I need from you, Mrs. Bryans. Thank you for your time." "Of course, sir. Oh, and please don't tell the principal that I told you anything." "I won't." I decided to go down to the basement to investigate the potential crime scene, in hopes of finding some evidence. On my way down there, I kept thinking about Gerald and his tattoo. What did the tattoo mean? Was it some kind of cult? Is that why Lydia wasn't being honest with me? If this was some sort of illegal organization, then the entire police force may have trouble cracking it, let alone an alcoholic ex-cop going in on a one-man mission. Gerald was suspicious, but then again, so was the principal. Didn't he say that he had a lot of paperwork to do and stayed in his office the whole time on the day of the disappearance? You would think that he would mention going out on a crucial day, such as the one when a kid goes missing. If the cleaning lady's story was correct, then Greenwood couldn't have been down in the basement in time to harm the girl, but that didn't mean that he wasn't somehow involved. The basement was a lot colder than the other floors and absent of any bright lights. I could see how walking through here would be terrifying for children, especially if they were alone during nighttime. I located the faith and spirituality classroom and I went inside. It resembled a chapel more than a classroom, with rows of benches on both sides of the room, a small altar at the far end and a blackboard on the wall behind. I heard people say that they often get this overwhelmingly euphoric feeling when they enter the house of God, but I felt uneasy instead. I pulled out my flask and took a gleeful sip, before putting it back and getting to work. As expected, the place was pristine and spotless. I doubted that I would find any evidence whatsoever, but I decided to comb through anyway. Only 5 minutes into my search, I caught something at the corner of my eye. I wouldn't have noticed it at all unless I came all the way around to the other side of the altar. And once I was there, I saw a tiny cross tucked under it, blending in with the colors around it. I approached it and grabbed it between my index and thumb. It was tiny and caked with a layer of dirt. As I raised it, I realized that the cross was actually a necklace, the same kind that Lydia was wearing. I pulled out Alexandra's picture and sure enough she wore one in it. This was a religious school, of course, so It could have been anyone's. But the thing is, I saw nobody else wearing it over their uniforms. Upon closer inspection of the necklace, I realized that it had been broken at one of the chains, which further enforced my theory that something strange had happened here. I examined the nearby area but found no traces of blood or anything else wrong. It has been a week though, so anything could have happened since then. I cleaned the cross and I put it in my pocket. If Lydia proved to be trustworthy, I would show it to her face and ask her if she recognized it. One thing was for sure though, something had happened here, a struggle or something. The kids here were so disciplined it didn't seem like they would get violent with each other, at least not around an altar which I assumed they were forbidden from even approaching. I decided to go back and question Gerald again, but by the time that I got to the entrance, he was already gone. The principal had left too, so I would have to leave the questioning for tomorrow. I checked Lydia's address and drove to it. She lived in an average house, devoid of any prominent features, in an even quieter part of the town, isolated from the rest of the households. I rang the doorbell and she opened the door, greeting me with a smile. "Detective, come on in," she said. I nodded and followed her inside to the living room. We sat down and she offered me a drink. I refused and took a sip from my own flask, before deciding to focus on business. "So, what have you come up with, Detective?" she asked. "No. First, you're going to give me some answers," I said. She crossed her legs and put her hands around her knee. "Fair enough. What do you want to know?" she asked. "Who are you?" I leaned forward. "My real name is Lydia Burrows, as you've already found out. Alexandra's mother, my sister, died years ago." "You're Alexandra's aunt?" I asked. She nodded. "Then why does everybody in town say they don't know you?" "Because they don't know my real name. I go by the name Lydia Stevens, a lonely woman with no family living at the edge of the town." "That still doesn't answer a lot of the other questions that I have," I said. "And I will give you the answers in a bit. Tell me, have you found out anything useful on your investigation so far?" I put my hand in my pocket and pulled out the tiny cross. Lydia widened her eyes and opened her mouth, immediately standing up and grabbing the cross. She examined it with relish as she said, "This was Alexandra's, no doubt about it. You see the engraving over here." She pointed to extremely tiny letters, easily missable. She said, "It says, 'May God protect you, daughter.' It was given to her by your mother. Where did you find it?" She spoke with energy in her voice, in contrast to the frigidity that she often displayed. She sat back down and stared at me, expecting an answer. "In the school basement. Whoever kidnapped her, they did it there." She gently placed the cross on the table and cleared her throat. She said, "You remember the picture that I sent you? Did you see anybody with it?" "The caretaker had a tattoo. What does it mean?" "It's the mark of a very old, very secret society in this town. They've been in this town since the beginning. They've infiltrated the town years ago and they continue to poison it. They have no name and the people here are too afraid to give them one. The truth is, Detective, they haven't abducted only 6 children. They've abducted 48. "What?" I scoffed. "Since around the mid-70s, the Order has been abducting 1 child every year. The children were never found, but it's well known what happened to them." "What did happen to them?" I asked, at the edge of my seat, curious. "The Order believes that there's a corruption in town. They believe that sacrifices are needed in order to appease the beast that resides within. Most of the children were abducted and sacrificed, but some of them were willingly sacrificed by their own parents, the members of the Order." "So why did they start kidnapping children monthly now?" "They believe that the deity they seek to appease has grown in appetite and requires more innocent souls. They tried abducting children twice a year, but since they didn't work, they increased the number in hopes to stop the corruption. That's crazy. A secret society is abducting children and sacrificing them to a demon. You expect me to believe that crap? I said as I stared at her judgmentally. Lydia stood up. She crossed her arms and walked over to the bookshelf behind her. "Are you a religious man, detective?" she asked, looking through the books. She turned her head to face me while holding one hand on the bookshelf. "No," I sternly said. "Is it because of your daughter?" she asked with a curious expression on her face. I shot my head up to her, suddenly feeling my heart beginning to race. Lydia took out a thick book and sat back down in front of me, placing the book on the coffee table. Only then did I notice the big cross and a triangle symbol across the cover. "I know about you, detective," she said confidently. "I know you were a homicide detective who worked in a case involving a cult. I know how they... I'm sorry. I know that losing a child must be very difficult." I felt anger boiling up in me. Who was she to talk about my daughter as if she knew her? I took out a cigarette and I lit it up, bottling up my anger. I puffed it and said, "With all due respect, I don't think you do know. Amber was only 8. She was full of life and she had a bright future ahead of her. She wanted to become a doctor, but then her future was taken away from her by some sicko who burnt her alive because he believed God had told him to do so." Lydia stared down at the book with a sorrowful expression on her face. There was a long silence until I puffed my cigarette once more and said, "If there is a God, Mrs. Burroughs, then he is a cruel one to create such monsters in the world. And he is even more cruel for allowing innocent children to die in such gruesome ways." She tentatively looked up at me. "Did you quit the force after that?" she said. I shook my head. "Yeah, but not before I got revenge for Amber. The cult had already killed dozens of children. Everybody was afraid to take the case and track them down, fearing that their family would end up like mine. I had nothing else to lose, so I worked on the case day and night for an entire year. Eventually, I found them and there was a raid in their hideout. Most of them were captured and sentenced to life, but that was not enough for me. I used my connections to bribe the prison guards and the cult leader's cellmate. I felt anger seeping out of me as I talked about this. Let's just say that the leader renounced all his gods and begged for mercy before he died." There was another long pause before Lydia said, "That's why I never told you about my true intentions. If I had told you that there was a cult involved in all of this, you never would have taken the case, right?" she asked. Well, I nodded and she was right. There was no way that I would have taken on another cult case, despite having nothing more to lose. "So this cult," I said, "how do you even know about them if they're so secretive?" "Well, that's another thing that I didn't tell you," she said. She pulled up her sleeve to reveal the tattoo of the cross inside a triangle on her forearm. "I used to be a member," she said. I puffed my cigarette as I stared at Lydia's tattoo. I didn't know what to think exactly, so I simply stared. "Why are you telling me all this now?" I asked. "Well, because I owe it to you. I want you to trust me. I want Alexandra found, dead or alive. She's my niece and I love her." "So if you were a member, then you know who the others are and where we can find them." "It's not that simple," she shook her head. "Members are required to wear masks at all times during the meetings. I could never tell who was in the room with me. Important missions are entrusted only to those called devoted, and the hideout of the order is changed often to avoid getting caught." "I see," I responded. There was silence in the room for a while before she said, "Do you have any leads, detective?" "I do," I nodded. "The caretaker and the principal. I need to question them again tomorrow." "Well, if you like, you can stay here for the night. There is also a motel nearby, but they charge a lot, since we rarely get any visitors. Thank you. I spent the night at Lydia's place, and the following morning I went back to the school. The caretaker, Gerald, was at the entrance, reading his book as usually when I arrived. When he saw me, a forced smile was strewn across his face as he stopped reading. He looked like somebody who managed to get rid of the vermin in his garden, only to see them back there again the following day. "A detective, you still have business here, I assume?" he asked. I took a look at the book that he was reading, God Can and God Will by Ronald Fry. I didn't see the symbol of the order anywhere, but I figured they probably would not want to advertise it so openly. "Good read?" I asked. "It sure is," Gerald said. "It's about a man who found his purpose in life in prison through God. He explains that all of us can change and atone for our sins." And do you think you would find yourself through God if you were put in prison now? I grunted and sat on the edge of the desk, towering above the caretaker. He didn't answer. "That's an interesting tattoo that you have on your forearm, Gerald," I said, pointing to his sleeve-covered arm. "It's a reminder," Gerald said with a grievous expression on his face. "Oh yeah, a reminder of what?" "A reminder of the mistakes I made in my life, of what I am and what I am not anymore," he retorted. I gave him a courteous smile. I pulled on my notes and said, "Mr. Gerald, when we talked yesterday, you failed to tell me that on the day of Alexandra's disappearance, Principal Greenwood came to speak to you. Why?" Gerald shrugged. "I didn't think that it was important. I must have forgotten." He scratched the back of his head, a sure sign that he was uncomfortable. "What did the principal want to talk to you about?" I asked, sternly staring at him. "Nothing special, just gave me a task to resolve around the school, that kind of thing." He shrugged again. "What task did he give you?" I asked. He started to stutter before saying, "Mowing the lawn, oiling the gate, something like that." I tapped my notes with the pen slowly while staring at him. He moved his gaze away as if too nervous to look at me. I said, "It doesn't seem very likely that he would just come to talk to you for that." Gerald simply shrugged again, looking down at the book. I turned to face him and leaned in closer. "Gerald, spare me the BS, I said. "If you're somehow involved in the little girl's disappearance, then you'll be going to prison for long enough to write a book like Ronald Fry here. And right now things aren't looking too good for you. You understand?" And Gerald sighed, tapping his foot on the ground nervously. He looked at me and said, "There's a man who came here last Thursday. I don't know who he is, which is strange because I know everybody around these parts. But he came asking for Principal Greenwood. I pointed him to the principal's office, and around 10 minutes later, Greenwood came to see me." I didn't want to interrupt him now. Gerald said, "He told me to not mention to anyone that I saw that stranger, not even to the police. He threatened that he would fire me and that I would be in even more trouble with someone else." Something about the way that he hesitated before saying that last part, it made me realize that we were on the same page, and so I got daring. "The order?" I asked. He looked at me with perplexity in his eyes, obviously surprised that I knew about the order. "How do you know about that?" he asked. "Your tattoo. You're wearing the mark." "Yeah, but I'm not a member anymore. Haven't been in over 30 years. I've been hearing stories about them my whole life when I was young, about cleansing of corruption and so on, and I decided to join them when I was only 18. I didn't know back then what they did to children, so when I found out, I got out of the group." "You joined a secret cult only to leave shortly after, and they let you just go like that?" I asked. Gerald pulled the collar of his shirt down to reveal the tattoo on his upper chest. It was a similar tattoo to the one on his arm, only the cross was upright and the triangle was upside down. This is their brand on the people who decide to leave. It's a mark of shame and weakness, but also a reminder that revealing anything about the cult can have dire consequences. It's also a warning for other members not to talk to the likes of us. He hastily pulled the collar back up, as if covering his private parts, and stared back down at the book. With visible shame in his eyes, he said, "I know that I shouldn't have listened to Greenwood, but the cult is more powerful than you think. He threatened that my son could be the next one to go missing if I talk. I had no choice, you understand that, don't you?" I didn't really feel pity for Gerald, even though I understood his situation. I put my notes back in my pocket and stood up. "Yeah, I understand," I said. "This man who came to the school, how did he look?" I couldn't see his face clearly since he had a hoodie over his head. "I see. I think I'm gonna pay a visit to the principal," I said, and I left faster than Gerald could respond again. Darcy jerked her head in my direction when I burst inside the principal's office. I didn't stop to greet her, but instead I went for the door. Sir, you can't go in there," she shouted after me, but I was already inside the office. She closed the door behind me and faced Principal Greenwood, who had a baffled look on his face sitting behind the desk. "Detective Torres, can I help you?" he asked somewhat impatiently as I sat in the chair in front. "Greenwood, yes you can. You can start by telling me who you talked to last Thursday." "We already talked about this, Detective. I already talked to Mrs. Bryans and Gerald. The cleaning lady said that she saw you leave your office, which is uncanny of you. And Gerald told me about the shady person who came asking for you. Does any of that ring a bell?" Greenwood breathed in through his nose loudly and thought for a moment before saying, "There was one person in school, come to think of it, but he and I did not talk." "Oh, is that so? Why did he ask for you then, and why do you threaten the caretaker?" Greenwood licked his lips and frowned as if preparing to say something important. "Detective, I don't appreciate you barging into my office like this with false accusations. You're not a police officer, so you have no authority here. Now, why don't you haul your drunk butt out of here before I throw you out myself?" He stared at me with his fingers crossed, his lips contorted into a thin slit, and he frowned. I stared at him for a moment. I nodded defeatedly and stood up, making my way back to the door. There was a key in the doorknob, and so I turned it and I locked the door. I put the key in my pocket and I strode back to the principal. His look of anger turned into one of confusion. "Hey, what are you?" Before he could finish his sentence, I punched him in the face, knocking him out of the chair and onto his back. He grabbed his face painfully and I took him by the hand, lifting his arm up and pulling his sleeve. Sure enough, the tattoo of the order was on his arm, prominent against his bulky forearm. I punched him in the face once more and grabbed him by his shirt. "Who did you talk to?" I spat in his face while he widened his eyes in fear, panting. "You're out of your mind, I didn't." Before he could finish, I punched him once more in the face and then in the gut. He coughed and raised his hand in a stop sign, saying, Okay. There was a guy who came into my office here on Thursday, but I don't know what he wanted," Greenwood recited. "BS," I shouted and prepared to punch him again. "Wait, please, I'll tell you." There was a knock on the door and Darcy's muffled voice as she asked, "Principal Greenwood, is everything okay?" The principal looked in the direction of the door and shouted, "Darcy, call the—" I punched him again before he could say anything more and he groaned in pain. My patience was nearly down to 0 by then, so I reached behind my back and pulled out my revolver. The principal grew even more afraid at this. I placed the muzzle of the gun on his forehead and shouted, "Talk." "I can't, they'll kill me." "Well, I'm about to kill you as well, so talk." "I don't know his name, I swear. He's a new member of the order and he came to the school on the arrangement to take Alexandra." I pulled the hammer of the gun back and Greenwood started talking even faster. "I arranged a false after-class activity for her to attend. She went down into the basement. The guy with the scar went there to kidnap her, and that's the last that I ever heard of either of them, I swear." "Where is she now? Where?" I shouted. I don't know. I was only told to organize it. I don't know where she was taken. They don't tell me anything. Where's the Order's hideout? I don't know. I backhanded him and he shouted, I swear that I don't know. I just joined the Order a month ago. They don't let their new members in on their meetings. How do I find the guy with the scar? He's often in the Good Siblings bar on Mitchell Street. That's where he and I meet at. I dropped the principal on the ground and walked over to the door. As he regained his breath, he said, You don't know who you're messing with, Torres. The Order's everywhere. When they find you, they'll what? You better hope that girl's still alive, Greenwood, because if the Order doesn't kill you, I will. And with that, I unlocked the door and exited, with Darcy's frightened gaze following me intently the whole time. A little later, I was on the street in front of my car lighting a cigarette. I stared at the school, which stood like a silent behemoth. Not a single sound of people's voices or cars on the street. I puffed, the wisps of smoke merging and disappearing into the air. It was still too early for me to go to the Good Siblings bar, but I could go and investigate it. Who was the man who came to the school? Clearly, he was a member of the cult responsible for kidnapping Alexandra. But where did he take her? The cult itself seems to be really careful. If somebody like the principal didn't know their plans, they must have entrusted the entire kidnapping plan to only their highest-ranking members. But I was nowhere near finding them. I was about to open the door of my car when I heard the sound of a gun being cocked behind my head. Don't move, a somewhat rough female voice said. I slowly put my hands on the roof of my car and said, This isn't the first time that I've been held at gunpoint, you know. Well, it could be your last. I slowly put my hand on the cigarette in my mouth and puffed it once more, before letting the butt drop next to me. So you're from the Order? I asked. Shut up, the lady said and pressed the barrel of the gun closer to my head. She checked my right coat pocket and then the left one, putting her hand inside to see if I had anything in there. She said, You're looking for the kidnapper, right? Yeah. Well, he's dead, the lady said. Screwed something up big time so they had him killed this morning. Crap. Now I lost my only lead. The lady took a step back and said, You've been meddling in our business too much. We don't usually let people go, but I'm feeling generous today, so I'm gonna give you a fair warning. Leave Northberry and forget everything you saw here, you understand? I shook my head. I can't do that, and you know it. I'm in too deep. So if you're going to shoot me, just shoot. There was no response. Hey, you don't have to leave me hanging here. I repeated, and I dared to slowly turn around. No one was there. I put my hands in my coat pockets, cursing under my breath. I felt something in my left pocket, and when I pulled out my hand, I saw a small, wrinkled piece of paper. On it was a hastily written address. Maybe it's a trap, I thought as I stared at the address, but that didn't make sense. The cult lady could have just shot me right there or taken me hostage if they had planned on performing some BS ritual on me. My only lead being dead, I decided to visit the address. Everything was close in Northberry, so I was there in only 5 minutes. The address given to me was an old house in what looked like a not-so-nice part of town. I assumed that this was one of those morbid places that would be left out of the pamphlets if they were to promote tourism here. I contemplated waiting in the car for the person who lived there to go out so I could catch them by surprise, but given the fact that there were no other cars around, I was as inconspicuous as a polar bear in a jungle. I finished one cig and got out of my car, double-checking the address on the paper and the number of the house. I knocked on the door, which looked like it was just about ready to fall from its hinges, and I waited. There was a sound of hushed, muffled voices coming from inside, and a batter of heavy footsteps resounding from within. A moment later, the sound of unlocking clicked loudly and the door opened slightly ajar, just enough for me to see half of a thin and sunken face. A door chain stretched itself between the inside of the wall and the door itself, as the man stared at me with a blue eye from behind his cover. Yes? He asked, skeptically eyeing me from top to bottom. I'm Detective Torres. I'm here to investigate the missing children's case. Can I come inside? The man thought for a moment before timidly answering. I'm sorry, now is not really a good time. He tried closing the door in my face, but I stopped him and said, Please, all I'm asking is for a few minutes of your time. Someone's life could be in danger. The man stared at me for a long moment before shutting the door in my face. A moment later, the sound of metal sliding resounded and the door opened widely. In front of me stood a man as skinny as I expected him to be, with bulging eyes and greasy brown hair which fell down to his shoulders, and an oversized t-shirt. He stepped aside and allowed me to go in. The inside of the house was a mess with wrappers and containers from ordered and fast food, strewn all over the coffee table and knocked over onto the floor. Sorry about the mess. I've been working a lot lately and I didn't have any time for anything else, he said. He picked up the Chinese takeaway plastic from the sofa and offered me to sit, but I politely declined. Staring at the mess made me think that a rat was going to jump out of the pile, but at the same time this lifestyle reminded me very much of my own. Only instead of food I had empty booze bottles all over the place and it reeked of cheap alcohol. I glanced at the man's forearms. He had a bandage over his left arm. Did you injure yourself? I asked. Yeah, I broke a glass in the kitchen a few days ago, he said, looking at his forearm and then back at me. Can I see? It might be serious, I said. It's really nasty. I think it's not a good idea. The man suddenly seemed to become nervous. I'm fine with that, but I need to check to make sure that you're not infected. I really don't. Please, I insist. It was an order and he knew it. He hesitated, looking as if he was thinking of what to use as an excuse. A moment later, he started unwrapping his bandage. I put my hand behind my back, ready to draw my gun in case he tried to do something stupid. The bandages came off layer after layer until they turned to pink and then red. When he finally reached the end and took it off, along with the gauze, he displayed his forearm to me. There was a wound about 2 inches long and 1 inch wide, in the crude shape of a rectangle, as if the skin had been flayed off. That must have been one heck of a shard, I said. He didn't respond. I turned around and took a few slow steps, glancing around the room. I heard voices. Is somebody else in here with you? I asked. No, it's just me, the man responded a little too quickly. Just then, there was a thud from my nearby closet door to my right. What was that? I asked. Nothing, it's just the washing machine, the man said, staring at me with the expression of someone who was playing the hot and cold game with you, and hoping that you wouldn't look in the right place. I ignored him and drew my gun. I grabbed the doorknob and got my gun ready. Detective, wait, don't open it, the man shouted, but it was too late. I had already swung the door open and pointed at the figure that was seated inside. I immediately lowered my gun at the sight in front of me. A little girl with messy black hair, dirty school clothes, and a scared look in her eye. It was Alexandra. Detective, I can explain, it's not what you think, the man said. Shut up, I pointed the gun at him. On your knees. You don't know what you're doing, he said. I said on your knees. The man looked down and then swung his arm, flinging the nearby lamp in my direction. It hit my shoulder, and in that moment the man tackled me. I can't let you take her back, he said, as we wrestled with the gun. A loud bang resounded and the man fell on top of me. Alexandra screamed and I pushed the assailant off me, his lifeless body slumping onto its back, staring vacantly at the ceiling. He was dead. Are you okay? I'm here to save you, I said, gesturing for her to come to me. I wasn't sure if I could trust the cops. The order seemed to be deeply rooted inside the town and I couldn't tell if the police were in on it. I called the only person that I could, Lydia. She arrived within minutes, and when she saw Alexandra, she let out a sigh of relief and rushed to her knees to hug her. But that was it. She seemed only relieved, not ecstatic as I imagined a parent should be when he finds his missing child. Alexandra herself seemed catatonic the whole time and still frightened, even when looking at the familiar face of her aunt. Lydia finally stood up and said, "Thank you, Detective, for finding Alexandra for us." I felt good. I had just saved the life of a little girl, something that I couldn't do for my own daughter. For the first time in a long time, I sincerely smiled. That was until my eyes fell on Lydia's upper chest, revealing above her dress. There was nothing there, no markings. She smiled and I heard the door burst open. I turned around to see a group of hardened, burly men and one short-haired woman standing menacingly in the doorway. "She almost managed to escape the order," Lydia said. I turned to face her and felt a blunt hit on the back of my head. As it started to ring in my ears, I found myself on the ground, my vision blurry and spinning. I heard Alexandra scream for them to stop as one of the men grabbed her roughly and held her back. Lydia crouched in front of me and said, "You see, the order never managed to kidnap Alexandra. It was entrusted to one of our members, but then Samir had to do what he thought was right." She pointed to the man that I had killed earlier. His conscience got in the way and he decided to take her into his home, to keep her safe from the order. So here we are. She stood up slowly and faced away from me, crossing her arms. I tried to wriggle out of the grip of my assailants, but was instead met with a kick to the side. Tears welled in my eyes from the pain, and I took a mental note not to try to resist again. Lydia approached a now much more frightened Alexandra and put her hand on the child's tear-covered face. "But now that she's here, we can finally proceed with the ritual," Lydia said for the first time with some audible emotion, audible happiness in her voice. She walked around me and left the room while the man holding Alexandra followed. "What do we do with the pig and the traitor?" the man holding me had asked. "Leave him to me," the short-haired woman said, as she took my gun from one of the men. I recognized that voice. "All right, get back to the sacred site as soon as you dispose of them," the man holding me said, and I felt his grip loosen. Soon everybody had left the room and it was only Sam, the woman, and I remaining. She walked over to the window and peered through before pulling the blinds over the windows, further dimming the room. She stood in front of me, towering as she gave me a disgusted glance. "You idiot. What were you thinking trusting Lydia?" She shook her head. She threw my gun in front of me, which clattered on the ground. She walked over to the door and opened it. When she saw me staring back at her, confused, she rolled her eyes and said, "Well, come on, old man. We gotta get to the mines." I stood up with a loud groan. "I'm not that old," I said as I placed the gun behind my back. The short-haired lady was already outside and waiting in front of my car. I strode to her and opened the door. My mind was still racing a million thoughts a second, and I didn't even stop to think if she would double-cross me like Lydia did. But it wouldn't make sense for her to do that. They had me pinned down and she didn't have to let me go, right? We got in the car and she said, "Just go straight, I'll tell you when to turn, and step on it." She was stern in her attitude, and the first thought that came to my mind as I put my keys into the ignition was, her poor husband. The tires screeched as we drove off. "If we hurry up, we should be there before they kill the girl," she said. "You're the one who held me at gunpoint earlier today now, aren't you? The one who gave me the address," I said, glancing at her. She nodded and put her elbow on the side of the window, exposing the order's tattoo. "Yeah, name's Melissa. I've been trying to find Alexandra for weeks." "You what?" I asked. "Yeah, I infiltrated the order to find out what's going on with the missing children. But since I'm relatively new, I couldn't do anything openly, since they were always watching me. So your timing with the arrival is excellent, Detective." I scoffed, shaking my head. "Are you a cop?" I asked. "Oh no, just a Northberry citizen." "So what is really going on here?" I asked. Melissa sighed. "Lydia is the leader of the order, at least I think she is. She's the one who decides whose kid gets sacrificed to cleanse the corruption in the town. She used quotation marks with her fingers. A few years ago, she sacrificed her own daughter, burnt her alive. Christ, did she do something to Alex's mother? Oh no, that wasn't her, but I'm sure she would have, if the kid's mom had interfered. She's ruthless and will not stop at anything to complete the ritual. I once saw her cut out a guy's tongue for asking her why they needed to sacrifice kids. I scratched my chin, giving my brain time to process what I was hearing. I said, "So let me get this straight. The cult organized for Alexandra to be kidnapped, but a renegade cultist decided to rescue her before the cult could take her. And then, since Lydia couldn't find her, she hired me to solve the case for her." "Played you like a piano," Melissa said. "How could she?" "You didn't have to kill that guy in the house," she judgmentally rebuked. "I didn't. We were wrestling for the gun and he must have accidentally pulled the trigger. He was right to attack me though." "And turn right over here," Melissa pointed. We were at the edge of town with houses to the right and forested terrain to the left, hills rising tall. "So what do we do? There's probably too many of them," I asked. "There are more rebels inside the cult. They'll be at the ritual. All I gotta do is give them the sign and they'll unleash everything they got." That was our last plan in case everything else failed. "What if there's not enough of them?" "Well, then we all die," she shrugged. We drove for another few minutes until the remaining houses disappeared and we reached a huge, fenced-off area to our left. Melissa told me to pull up near the entrance, and from there, we got out of the car. The rickety gate was open despite the sign which said "No trespassing." Far up ahead was a quarry stretching probably at least a whole mile, and way down below was the entrance into the mines. "Come on, we gotta hurry," Melissa said and proceeded down the makeshift staircase made from old, rotted planks, which went around the inside wall of the quarry. It took us a good 5 minutes to reach the bottom, and by the time that we did, I already felt like I needed another drink. I suppressed my desire and followed Melissa inside the dark entrance, leaving all vestiges of light behind. "Try to be quiet," she said in a whisper and pulled out a flashlight. She illuminated the path ahead and started walking. She seemed to know her way around the place, and then I figured she must have been here many times before. "Is this the hideout?" I said. "Yeah," she simply said. It wasn't long until we had started to hear voices echoing in the distance. I couldn't discern what they were saying since they were too far away though. Melissa didn't seem fazed by this as she didn't even stop. I drew my gun and as we went on, the voices got louder and louder. I still couldn't make out what they were saying, and eventually, I realized the reason for that was the fact they weren't speaking English. It sounded like church chanting in a language unlike any that I had ever heard before. Probably dozens of people all chanting at the same time. Melissa raised her hand for me to stop once more, so I complied. There was faint orange light gleaming from around the corner, and it was evident that the voices were coming from right there. Melissa peeked carefully and then went back to me and said, "Take a look." I carefully approached and slowly peeked. I saw a huge area with what looked like dozens of people dressed in red robes facing away from me. They all held lit candlesticks, staring up at an elevated area which had something that looked like an altar on the top. Alexandra was there, held firmly by two cultists by her arms, while Lydia faced the crowd, holding her arms up high with a knife in one of her hands. She was looking up and chanting something, as if in a trance, and the entire group repeated after her. "So now what?" I asked, turning to Melissa. "Go around over there, you'll be able to get behind and rescue Alexandra. I'll distract them." "Wait, are you crazy? They'll kill you." "Trust me on this, detective." She put her hand on my shoulder and nodded. I snuck all the way around to the other side and peeked around the corner. The altar was in front of me with Lydia facing away this time. I got my gun ready and I waited impatiently. The chanting permeated the mines, sung in such unison that the walls vibrated. "Hey!" A voice shouted and the chanting stopped. All the faces turned around to face Melissa, who stood there cool as a cucumber. "What is the meaning of this, recruit?" Lydia asked. "Zealots, bring her here." A few men started walking towards her, but she drew a gun and pointed it at them. They recoiled in fear, to which Lydia got angrier. "What are you waiting for? Kill her!" Melissa shot a bullet into the air, and the next few things that happened were so quick that they became a blur. I saw the majority of the group rush at Melissa. I saw a big number of the cultists take off their masks, drawing their guns and starting to shoot at the others. I saw Melissa shooting at the crowd which was approaching her, but she was overwhelmed. I couldn't see what happened to her, but I used the moment to rush up to the altar. Before they even realized what was going on, I shot one of Alexandra's captors in the back of the head. The other one turned around, and when he saw me, he took a few steps back, ready to run. I shot him too because screw negotiating with brainwashed fanatics. "Alexandra, come on!" I gave her my hand and she immediately took it, albeit confused in the whole mess. "We gotta run." Suddenly, the entire place had started shaking and I lost my balance. There was something that sounded like a deep, enormous groan resonating throughout the entire mines. An earthquake. The ceiling started to collapse, big chunks of rock falling down, crushing many of the cultists and undercover rebels. "Detective, stop!" Lydia shouted, staring at me. She had a look of worry and desperation on her face. "You don't know what you're doing. The corruption has to be stopped. We have to sacrifice—" Her words were cut off when a big piece of ceiling fell right on top of her head, leaving nothing more visible than her hand hanging out from under the boulder, red oozing out. I remember feeling relish, seeing Lydia's life snuffed out like that. "Come on," I shouted at Alexandra and pulled her. "Wait, she's right, we have to complete the ritual," Alexandra said. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Did they brainwash her? "If we don't, the entire town will die," she said. "Forget the town," I rebutted and picked her up, despite her protest. I wasn't going to let her die here. She thrashed against me, but I ran. Melissa ran across our path on the way out. She was badly beaten, but still alive. She led us outside as the entire place continued shaking more and more violently, the deep groan getting louder and louder, sounding like some beast that we awoke from a long slumber. Many of the cultists were running in panic, while some were on their knees, seemingly praying, but mostly were already dead. "We're almost there, come on," Melissa shouted. I was wheezing like an asthmatic by that point, barely able to keep up in my poor condition with a little girl slumped over my shoulder. I cursed for allowing myself to get in such bad shape. I saw the light of day and it gave me a renewed hope, so I ran even faster despite my lungs and legs burning. We were out, but we didn't stop for another 10 seconds or so. There was a loud crack and suddenly the ceiling collapsed, blocking the mine's exit. About a dozen people managed to escape, running for their lives in panic, both cultists and rebels alike. I couldn't be bothered chasing them. The final rumbles beneath the earth died down. People's screams abated and then everything went silent. I put Alexandra on the ground, panting for life. "Alexandra, are you okay?" Melissa asked the kid. She hugged her and stroked her hair to calm her down. I'm fine too," I said sarcastically between breathing, chuckling at my own joke. Melissa looked at me with compassion and said, "Thank you, you saved your life." "What about the order?" I asked. "Oh, they'll be back. The surviving members will reorganize the order to stop the corruption from spreading." "Ah, screw me," I said. "Hey, language," Melissa rebutted, looking at Alexandra, signaling me not to swear around the kid. I stared at the mine entrance, processing what had just happened. As I stared, I saw traces of coal and tar strewn about the ground, stretching from the entrance like veins. The gust of air must have pushed some of it out from the mine, I thought. We got Alexandra back to her dad, and I decided to stay in Northberry a little longer. The order had to be eliminated, and I couldn't leave. A lot of the stragglers gave themselves up, but I wouldn't stop until every last one of them was no longer a threat. It wasn't until one day about a month after rescuing Alexandra that I heard the news that the people living near the mines had to be evacuated. I asked Melissa what was going on, and she threw some photographs on the desk in front of me. I flipped through them. They were photos of the mines and the houses that we saw on our way there, but something was wrong. The traces of coal that I saw on the ground at the mine after escaping were much more spread now. The entire quarry was completely black, covered in a tar-like substance, and much of it creeped onto the road and even overtook some of the houses nearby, making them look like they were dipped in tar. The black substance ended in the middle of the street, spreading at the edge just like it did in the quarry, like roots or veins, menacingly reaching out to devour the street. "What is this?" I asked. Melissa pursed her lips. "The corruption," she said.